Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications. Patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is home ownership consultant Ross Kay from the WealthyHomeowner.ca, Canada's authority on home ownership. Welcome back to the show, Ross.
Thanks for having me back on, Jim.
Ross, several questions from our listeners, so let's just wade right into them. We have Austin from Markham, Ontario, who asks, the Bank of Canada is set to begin increasing interest rates. I'm wondering if my first mortgage should be a variable one to get the lowest rate or a fixed one to grab some security.
Well, a couple of whammies here. First of all, if you haven't purchased a home, I highly recommend that you don't enter the housing market right now. So you need to get some outside assistance on that, but that is a general comment from the Markham housing market right now. Now you're talking about, you said your first mortgage, Austin, and then the question was variable versus fixed. So I'm going to give you some general ways of how we view your mortgage, and the way that we view it is how homeowners have viewed it for the last 40 years. Right now, today, you're looking around, the best rate that you're going to get for a 5-year fix is about 1.99%. A 1.99% mortgage is going to cost you right now about $423. When you look at the 5-year variable, for the sake of the argument, let's say you're 0.99%, that's going to be $376. Okay, so that's the context that we're looking at. So the difference between the two, 376 and 1.99 and $423 is about $50 a month, for the sake of the argument. So $50 a month is what your insurance policy is actually going to cost you, because that's how homeowners have always viewed fixed rate mortgages versus a variable rate, okay? Over the last, maybe 10 years, the conversation has shifted because you have access now to online tools to check your mortgages out. I'll give you some context for that. So when I first started selling real estate, now you have to understand, it was only 35 years ago. So I understand some of the listeners may only be 35, but to me it was just yesterday, 35 years ago. I had a mortgage table book. I had a little book that I carried with me that was filled with the mortgage tables. Every single mortgage, every single amortization was all in this one little book. You'd flip to it. You'd look at today, the mortgage rate that you're going to get, the amortization that you're going to take, and you'd calculate it from there. Well, of course, that's all done in an online calculator or on any spreadsheet commonly today. From the mortgage book table, I purchased a mortgage calculator. Now, understand, Austin, a mortgage calculator in the late 80s was just as expensive as going out and buying a Chromebook at your local Walmart store today, dollar for dollar. So this was an item that in my office we had about 25 agents. That was the number one office in all of Canada for RE/MAX at the time. I was the only agent who carried a mortgage calculator. So you would punch it in and you would come up with your numbers. But the general public really wasn't aware of what it was until they went to the bank, and the bank would talk to them. So they would leave, and if they had a question, they'd have to call the bank back up, because normally the real estate agent couldn't answer it. Again, they didn't have the calculator. Most real estate agents didn't carry mortgage tables. I mean, the only reason I carried them is because my dad made me carry them. And it's something that, we use as part of our day-to-day business. So that's how homeowners over the last few decades, have looked at their mortgage. They've looked at the variable rate and they've looked at the fixed rate and they said, what's it going to cost me different? Well, the cost that you're paying to take that fix is your insurance fee, your insurance premium. And in this case, it's $50 a month. So what we know, if you take a variable, every 6 months, you're technically going to have one full payment available that you saved. So if you save that money, put it in a separate bank account, every 6 months, you save that amount of money. And that's how you would protect yourself. But most homeowners won't do that. You'll have the money in the bank and it will go to something else. Your TV breaks, you get a new TV. Your dishwasher breaks, you get a new dishwasher. The patio needs to be fixed, you've got to get some lumber for the patio. That's just how it works. Ideally, you have a readvanceable mortgage. So you put that money that you would have paid on the fixed rate mortgage, the extra payment, on your readvanceable mortgage. Because with the readvanceable, that money's always available in case something happens. It's insurance. You can pull it back out again if you needed to. So that's kind of a double win. I think what you need to understand, Austin, is that we have gone through in August of 2021 or 2021. Okay, that was the 40th year anniversary of declining mortgage rates. Let me say that again, because you didn't read this in the newspaper anywhere. In August of 2021, we celebrated the 40th year anniversary of continually falling mortgage rates. 40 years. That means that our entire economy that exists today is a totally different economy than existed pre-1981, simply because of mortgage rates. Because we have gone through a period of 40 years of mortgage rates continually declining. On top of that, during that 40-year period, every single moment the housing market slowed down was a consequence of mortgage rates staying stable for a 3 to 4 month period or increasing. Any time that mortgage rates stayed stable longer than 2 to 3 months, I mean, they're going to go up a little tiny amount, but it doesn't really matter. It matters more today than it did when rates were back at 10 or 12%. But every time the housing market's cooled, your local banks, not the Bank of Canada, the big 6 Canadian banks used their mortgage discount rates to try to revive the housing market. As they were doing that, clearly the community who discussed interest rates at the Bank of Canada, which is also the bankers, decided that they needed to do something to stave off a house price correction. Now, of course, there have been periods where they couldn't stop it. The momentum happens too much. We're at one of those moments right now. Your listeners should understand that any time that the new mortgage originations decline, the housing market is correcting. So when you hear all these people talking about mortgage debt building up month after month, that's not what we measure. We measure new originations. Okay? So when we measure new mortgage originations, the moment, every single time from 1980 through till today, when those mortgage originations started to decline, all of a sudden your housing prices started to correct. Now, of course, you got to remember there's a period of correction before you get negative year-over-year prices showing up. And it depends on the momentum in the market when that negativity first shows up. So when we're talking mortgage rates, Austin, you can right now take that low rate, that 0.9% variable, if you're comfortable watching the mortgage market or you have someone talking to you all the time. You should also always have a 3 to 4 month mortgage booked somewhere else at the lowest rate, because then you can threaten to move your mortgage to the bank where you have the pre-approval done, the pre-approval with a guaranteed 3 to 4 month lock. That gives you a couple of months to test out your theory of what's going to happen with your mortgage rate when you see them start to rise. You also have to look at what's the cost going to be. We start out at 9.99%. Well, what if they go up to 1%, 1.25%, 1.5%, 1.75%, 2%, 2.25%, 2.5%? How quickly does that move? What is that going to cost you over the same period of time that fixed rate mortgage is? So those are all the questions you need to take into context, Austin. I hope that clears it up. But just remember, in August of this year, we celebrated 40 consecutive years of declining interest rate. When you get to the bottom, there's nowhere else to go. You have to start rising. And every single instance that they tried to raise mortgage rate, the housing market reversed.
We'll have more with Ross Kay right after this.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Ross Kay. Ross, Stephanie in Vancouver asks, Mr. K continually makes references to the late 80s and 90s about how tough it was to get into the housing market back then and how unaffordable it was for his own first-time buyers when he was selling real estate. I am struggling trying to see any comparison between how hard it is now versus back then.
Well, I mean, it's perspective, Stephanie. And that's something that you learn studying homeowners for decades, or generations for that matter. Perspective is the only thing that matters. So when I hear people complaining about getting into the housing market now, I hear their complaint as being legitimate, but I also hear it is coming from their perspective. So let me give you some context of what I'm talking about. When my great-grandfather came to Canada, this is a funny story. He was 13 years old, and he was an orphan. His father had died when he was 3. My grandmother had died when he was 10. So there was a program in Britain where they took orphan kids and they shipped them over to Canada. And when they shipped those orphan kids over to Canada, those orphan kids were sent to some farm, usually somewhere, to work. So that's how my great-grandfather, in the early 1900s, like 1902 or something like that, started his life in Canada. Now, he worked on the farm. He didn't go to school. He then went off to the war. And while he was off fighting the war, my great-grandmother, had her first baby, and they had it at the barracks in Toronto, the Stanley Barracks. So that's their framework when they bought a house. He came back from the war, worked 3 jobs, moved away from Toronto, and bought his first home. Had a great life. My grandfather, his son, so I'm talking on my father's side here. He worked 3 jobs after he got married in order to save enough money to earn or to have enough down payment for a house, because then you need to have 50% down to buy a house. Now, people can say, oh, well, they only needed $3,000 or $4,000 down, but you can imagine how hard that was. He was the child of the Depression. I mean, let's just be honest. Then my father. Okay, well, my father, when he met my mom and they got married, my dad was holding down 3 jobs. He'd work in the factory, he'd go to another factory, and then he'd come home and work on the farm to help pay the farmer, all the while building up his down payment. They bought their first house. It was a little tiny wartime house. My mother had to work to help my dad make the down payment by working out in the field. My grandmother helped my father make their down payment by working out in the field. Well, Ross, that was a long time ago. Well, guess what? When I bought my first house with my wife, I only had 1 job. So did she. The difference was those 1 jobs were 2 jobs. We had paychecks commonly where we were putting in 70 and 80 hours a week. My record week was 103 hours. 1 week, 103 hours. I worked at the garden center all week long. I lived there. We had frost warnings, everything. I took all the overtime that I could get. Well, I didn't actually get overtime. And within 6 months, we had saved enough money living at home to get our down payment. Now, don't think it was easy. Okay? She was putting in 70 to 80 hour weeks regularly. All we did was work. We didn't care. We were happy. We were saving our down payment. Our first mortgage was 13% interest. Think about that. 13%. Get your calculator out. Type in $70,000 at 13% interest and see what your payment is. So that's the perspective. So now I jump to today. My own kid, my oldest now is 30. I get a talk with him this week, and he informs me he's taking a second job. He now is going to work 2 jobs. Why? To get his down payment. Now, his problem is he wants to live in his hometown of Burlington. Well, in Burlington, 30 years ago, you could have started with a townhouse. You're not going to start with a townhouse today. You're going to start with a condominium, a small condominium, and you're going to have to move up to the property ladder. Each step you take, you're going to have to pay tens of thousands of dollars of commissions right now. Now, he won't because he'll follow the strategy where he doesn't have to. But the regular folks, his friends, that would be the situation that they're in. So what I can do is I can go right back from 2012 till 2022, and the home buyers are exactly the same. You have to make compromises to get your first step in the property ladder. I don't care about these stories that we hear about, oh, my parents lived in la land. Back in the 60s or 70s, they bought their single detached house and everything was rosy and cherry. Well, that's not how the majority of Canadians own homes. There is initially a lot of hard work as you're saving for your down payment. Can you imagine if my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, me, or even my son today believed they're going to have to work for 30 years to save a down payment, as some of these articles that we see out there? It isn't going to happen. There's choices and there's compromises, Stephanie. I'm not being critical, and I'm not trying to imply one time is harder than the other. I mean, I certainly know the working conditions that my great-grandfather and father and even grandfather had were far worse than the ones I had. I had labor laws that protected me, and that my son has today. My daughter, she's picked up an extra side hustle because she and her better half, they want to get out. And now they're also talking about moving to a different part of the province or the country to start their life. And I can't argue with them. The only thing that's really changed, Stephanie, is the discussion that you have. When I started out, there could have been 3 or 4 more generations of my family living in the same town, and it still would have been affordable. You know, my parents moved, so I moved with them as a kid, and we moved to towns where things were more expensive. When we first moved to Burlington, I was in university at the time, had the housing stock continued to grow in Burlington the way that it was growing for the first 15 years that I lived here, my kids would have a chance to start out life and get a home the same way that my wife and myself did here in this town. But that's not the case. For whatever reason, politicians decided they weren't going to build enough houses anymore. So you're left with that. So it's a struggle for everyone, but it's no more of a struggle today than it was for my great-grandfather as an orphan getting shipped over to Canada to work on a farm when he was 13 years old. Let's put everything in perspective. The beautiful thing about home ownership, the beautiful thing about studying the families who have owned homes, is the consistency that they have shown throughout the 50 years that we've studied them. It has always been unique, their situation, but they have also been very, very common. So I'm sorry, Stephanie. The solution may be that A, you move to a cheaper place, B, you pick up an extra job to save your down payment, or C, you make some adjustment somewhere else in your life so that you can make the compromise. What I will say, you mentioned Vancouver at the start of this discussion. The city of Vancouver and the city of Toronto are 2 totally different housing markets than everywhere else in Canada. They are the Beverly Hills of Canada. If you want to live in Beverly Hills, you better have a Beverly Hills income. Because if you don't, you're going to live off the crumbs that the government decides to leave you. There is no solution for housing affordability in Vancouver today because they are going to continue to allow the population to outgrow the housing stock. No answer in the city of Toronto today because they are going to continue to allow the population to outgrow the housing stock. That doesn't mean over the next 3 to 5 year period, you're not going to see housing prices correct, because you are. But what it means is that 10, 15, 20 years down the road, when your kids are starting to get older, if you got into the housing market once house prices correct in cities, your children are not going to be able to live in the city that they called home either. If that's what your plan is, then you should be seeking cities outside of Vancouver and the city of Vancouver and the city of Toronto. Because there is no way with growing population that 20 years from now, housing will be more affordable.
Did home sales increase in the GTA in November as the news reported?
Did home sales? No, they didn't, folks. what happened in this year, I'm assuming this listener must be talking about the Trub numbers. Okay, folks. So between October of last year and October of this year and November of this year, last year and November of this year, there is a trading day differential between those two combined months. And what that means is that sales that happened in October in Toronto this year got reported as being November. Last year, sales from November, more of the sales that took place in October were counted in October and not counted in November. This is the differential of this one trade. We call them trading days. There's also MLS reporting days. That's why you had negative year-over-year sales in October in Toronto, and you had positive year-over-year sales in November. It doesn't work that way, folks. In this case, there's about a 9% shifting of sales, net difference shifting of sales between October and November this year in comparison to October or November last year. That's why you got negative year-over-year sales in October, positive year-over sales in November. It's why seasonally adjusted numbers never work with organized real estate, because you can't seasonally adjust something that needs to be trading day adjusted and MLS reporting day adjusted in the first place. So no, sales didn't happen. Now, if you want to know further information about this, you need to look at the city of Burlington, because as I've said on this show, the city of Burlington is the center of the MLS universe in Canada, because Burlington reported more sales in 2014, 2015 than they did in 2021 in November. When you're hearing about record November sales, you've got to ask yourself, well, then why was Burlington having records back in 2014 or 2015 and 2016? Why did they not report record sales? Well, because that MLS system and the way that the agents work in that marketplace means that they're more timely posted on the MLS system, thus recorded in the system. Over the last 2 years, the system has reported on the same timeline because they wanted to get their stats in before, 5 days before historically they would get them done. That makes it so they could report to the Canadian Real Estate Association sooner, so that the Canadian Real Estate Association could prepare numbers for the Ontario Real Estate Association. That didn't happen a couple of years ago. It happens today. So when you're looking for true numbers, look in Burlington and see what's happening there, because it will tell you what's happening in the entire province of Ontario.
Another listener question: has the Vancouver average home price increased $200,000 since January of this year?
Sounds like somebody's looking at the benchmark price out in Vancouver, Jim. No, it hasn't. I think you're looking at the Greater Vancouver composite annual benchmark price that they come up with. Of course, you're not accounting for the readjustment of the index that they did. No, your sales have shifted. If you go out there and look for a condominium today, you're going to find it's no more money than it was last year at this time. So then how do you get a $200,000 increase? Oh, did it happen all in just single detached homes? No. The single detached homes that we're selling were more expensive. The buyers that were buying the homes were buying more expensive properties that had been upgraded higher. So that's not the average home. It's the best home. No. The average home has not increased $200,000 since January 1st of, I think this reference might have been to 2020, not 2021. Should have been 20. Anyways, no, they have not increased. I don't know what to tell you other than it's a standard benchmark. All these sort of myths are going to be debunked over the next 6 months.
Why does the Canadian Real Estate Association publish a 72-page report exclusively for Burlington, Ontario, or as the people in Hamilton call it, Hamilton Northeast?
Yeah, Hamilton Northeast. Okay, so when we left organized real estate, they were in a big bunch of trouble here in RAB because we were no longer silenced. So when I quit, turned in my realtor license, that meant that I no longer had to apply by the cone of silence that you accept when you license the realtor trademark. that created havoc here in the local Realtors Association of Hamilton Burlington. So that's why if you go back and you look at their stats from 2018, they had to do a big mea culpa in the Real Estate Board of Hamilton Burlington because they were caught fudging their numbers. Well, of course, it was us that caught them because we have the numbers. Nobody can argue with them. So then they came out with this new methodology. Okay, so if Ross Note was involved when the benchmark price was being created, and yeah, he has several times over the last 30 years fought against the Canadian Real Estate Association, how can we get around them, especially on the benchmark price? Well, they came out with their answer was a 72-page report. They only did 250 sales in all of Burlington last month, November, but they issued a 72-page report. That is like 3 pages per home that was actually sold. 3 pages. There is no city in North America that has the kind of report that's released for Burlington. Okay? Now, they've also had to do some work in Hamilton to justify why they released the report in Burlington. But how many pages is the Toronto Real Estate Board report for 10,000 sales? Minuscule compared to the report they do for Burlington. Okay? The reason they do Burlington is to attempt to cover up the years of deception that they have reported on as a national association. You see, the realtors in Burlington have had more presidents of the Ontario Real Estate Association per membership than any other board in the province. One of the former presidents of OREA actually owns the brokerage that my great uncle owned. He sold it to him when my dad wanted to go to RE/MAX. Still has the same phone number. The phone number that was on my mother's business card in the early 1980s is the same phone number that he uses today. Everything that's about the MLS systems in Canada starts at the Realtors Association of Hamilton, Burlington, and more specifically Burlington. First computerized system in Canada. First MLS system to have a weekly stats report, and that was way back in the 1980s. So their solution now is to try to cover up the misleading that they've been doing by publishing a 72-page report in Burlington. Well, how many pages of report in Vancouver, Greater Vancouver, Fraser Valley, Calgary, Montreal? Nothing compares to Burlington. It's the most huge report that you've ever seen. And it's, just gobbledygook designed to try to fool the public. They put out a massive part of the report is the benchmark price, trying to justify the benchmark price and how they break it down to try to confuse the public. You have to understand, some of the areas and house types for the benchmark price only had 2 homes selling them, 0.0002% of the housing stock in that neighborhood, yet they publish the benchmark price. It's hogwash. The only reason that report is published is because we're here, and we're watching them all the time, and we know how it works. That's why they never say anything about it. That's why we have online for 10 years. House prices don't change in 31 days. Yet not a single realtor in Canada has ever proven otherwise. They haven't even published anything where the public could see that they're trying to disprove what our statement is. Because you can't. House prices don't change in 31 days. And a housing market correction is when all of this stuff comes undone.
Ross, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thanks for having me on, Jim.
My guest has been home ownership consultant Ross Kay from the wealthyhomeowner.ca. If you have any questions for Ross, you can send them to info@housestreet.com. Find us on Twitter @HouseStreet. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. We're also on Facebook. I'm Jim Goddard. Thank you for listening.
Comments made on HouseStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HouseStreet.com radio is a production of House Street Media Incorporated.